Revelation 17. There is a lot in this chapter. We're not going to go through the whole thing because this chapter does start to get kind of technical. And there are some challenging passages within it. I think we have some good insights into it as a church, and as some modern Adventist scholarship has brought up some really good insights. So when you get into some of the, I wouldn't call it minutia, it's not the right word for it, because nothing in the Bible is minutia. But when you get into some of the more detailed, the technical elements of things, there's some differences of interpretation in different areas. But the broad, big picture, and especially some of the things we're going to be hitting on that I'll show you tonight, really the first 6 verses is where we're going to really focus. Boy, that's a powerful study. Now, let me pray, because I'm about to jump into it, so let's make sure we ask the Lord's blessing. Father, I thank you so much that you've given us the Scriptures, and in particular, Father, that you've given us the revelation of Jesus Christ, the last book of the Bible. Father in heaven, what an amazing book this is. And as we've been working our way through it, and also Daniel, you've been blessing us. We're so grateful, Father. Father, you've given us this book to help us know Jesus and see Jesus in a clearer way, especially for those of us living now in the last days. And Father, I pray as we study it tonight, this particular passage here, this section, I pray, Father, that your Spirit would be here to enlighten our minds, to draw our hearts closer to you, and to just bring clarity and a blessing upon us, Father. You promise this for those who read here and keep the words in this book, so we come with confidence with this request. We thank you, Father, for hearing us and answering. And we ask in Christ's name, amen. Wow, that happened quick. Rain is coming down. Okay, let's go big picture for a minute. Remember how we have that pattern of kind of repetition and enlargement, okay, like we find in Daniel. Like maybe this is Daniel 2, like right here, okay, and we get some information there, and that's pretty easy to understand. And then we get some more information, like it goes over the same ground, but gives us more detail, okay, into things in Daniel chapter 7. And then we get like to Daniel chapter 8, and it's repetition and enlargement, okay? And it just kind of continues going, right? And we would go, and this would be like Daniel 11, okay? And in each place we get more information. That would be Daniel 8 and 9, really. And that's a blessing, right? More information is better. As the more the more somebody, you're trying to understand something, like police officers, they're trying to solve a crime. Well, the more information they get, the clearer picture they're going to have of what actually happened, and they can catch who they're looking for. So it's a blessing, but also with more information, information increases complexity, right? The world is simple when you're 9 years old. Well, when you get to be 30 and 40 and 50 and all, you realize things a little more complex than they were when you were a kid. Well, the world hasn't become really more complex. It's just we've just learned more information, okay? And so information is good in that it brings light. It also adds complexity to things. And so you'll notice that each chapter here gets a bit more complex as we move through, but it's covering the same ground, right? It's just filling in more. Well, we have the same thing in the book of Revelation, okay? We have the 7 churches, okay? Then we have the 7 seals, and then we have the 7 trumpets. All right? And this is the first 11 chapters, okay? So it's chapters 1 through 11. And, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought I ran into somebody. I heard her walking. And anyway, this is what we got here, all right? And it's covering the same ground. And it actually does kind of increase like this, kind of in complexity. You get some more information. It helps to really clarify things. But it gets a little more challenging, right? And so this has to do with the church's relationship to God, the 7 churches, okay? Our relationship to the Lord. The 7 seals have to do with the Lord's relationship to us, okay? All the language that we find here in the 7 seals is really covenant language, like you find in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament was the book of the covenant. The whole thing is structured like a contract, okay? And covenants is, we would say today, contract, okay? So it's this covenant between God and Israel. And here's what God's part of the covenant is, or the contract. Here's what Israel's part of the covenant is in the contract. And just like most contracts say, if somebody signs a lease, right, to rent a place, and it says, if you don't pay, here's what's going to happen, right? It kind of spells out, here's what you're agreeing to do, here's what I'm agreeing to do, and then here's what's going to happen if either party doesn't do what they're supposed to do, okay? So that's what happens with this covenant. Like in Deuteronomy, this covenant language is, here's what God's going to do, here's what you agree to do. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, here's God's plan to remedy that, and here's ultimately where this will go. So that same language that we find there in Deuteronomy is the same language we find in the seals, okay? And so the seals are God working with His church through the ages, right, of essentially from the first century all the way to the second coming of Jesus. Okay, so like the church of Laodicea, seventh church in the last days, well, we're in that era right now, okay? Then the seals, all right, we're right there in that kind of that fifth, sixth seal kind of period right there. Seventh seal is heaven when it's all ended. Then you get to the seven trumpets. The trumpets are God's relationship to the unbelieving, hostile world. Okay, so the world that is hostile to Him, and it's really God's judgments upon the world. And man, it's the trumpets. I'm going to wait because I don't want to. I love this a lot, and maybe write a book on this one day. I like it so much. So I'm waiting but I'm too busy to do that. Like I'm never going to stop being busy, but. That's why I'm not going to maybe preach on this yet, but I want to get into this because I think the trumpets do a lot of explaining of where our world is today, okay, and what's going on with our world today. And you see the things going on in the news, the political upheavals in America and in the world. I think the trumpets really helps to explain that stuff very well, okay? So that goes through the first 11 chapters, and it all kind of covers the same ground, right? From the first century to the second coming, first century to the second coming, and just kind of fills it in more big picture. Because God, obviously God always likes us to keep the context, keep the framework, keep the big picture. That's where Israel got off. They kind of lost the big picture. When Jesus comes, they are so in the woods of minutia and debating silly little things that they miss the whole big picture when Jesus comes, right? They crucify the one they've been studying about all these years. And so God kind of gives us all this big picture so we keep the context, keep the framework, all right? I had a professor who taught me Revelation, John Pauline, and he recommended something that I also recommend as well. He says, I've dealt with a lot of people in the Adventist church and outside the Adventist church, lay people and scholars who have studied the book of Revelation, and some people just get way out there in their interpretations, strange ideas, and just kind of kooky stuff. And he said the way to keep balance in our studies, and particularly when we are wanting to study prophecy and this kind of stuff here, he says just read the Bible broadly. If you just spend time reading the Bible, I'm talking like Genesis to Revelation, just read the Bible, you keep the big picture in mind. You see the framework of how God works, and it keeps you from just getting off into the weeds somewhat. That's what usually happens to people when they get off into strange stuff, is they kind of lost context, and now they're just off in some weird place, okay? So, let me hit this too. So remember we talked about this, then Revelation 12. All right. Who can tell me what's in Revelation 12? It's off the top of your head. Anybody? The woman and the church and the dragon's right there. You go. Good job, Yesenia. So that's the one that is kind of the transitional thing, where it's kind of the foundational chapter. And then you get to Revelation. That's the great controversy chapter right here, okay? And then you get to Revelation 13. That is totally end times, and then it just zooms in on end times from here on out. All right? So all the way to Revelation 22, the end of the book. All right? So really Revelation 13 all the way to 18 is kind of describing all these, the mark of the beast and last day events and all that kind of stuff. And then you get to chapter 19, and that's the second coming of Jesus, and 20 is the millennium, and when sin and everything is destroyed, and then 21 and 22 is heaven, okay? So I just kind of go there because we took 2 weeks off, and we're about to jump in and with a microscope. And before we go with a microscope, I kind of like to go big picture, zoom out, and then we'll zoom on in. So let's go to Revelation chapter 17, okay? So this is covering the same ground as like Revelation 13. Remember the mark of the beast, 666. No man can buy or sell unless he has the mark of the beast, and so on. That's Revelation chapter. Hey Jojo, how you doing, bud? That's Revelation 13, and that's the mark of the beast and all that. Well, Revelation 17 is just another angle, but it's the same time period, the same issues, okay? Okay, Revelation chapter 17. I'll go ahead and read it. I'll read the first 6 verses. Y'all with me? I'm reading out of the ESV. I just have an app on my phone that has that, okay? Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, those are the plagues, that was just happening in chapter 16, came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." Hold on, I need to change a setting in my phone. It keeps on wanting to go dark on me after a few seconds to save power. All right, come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters. Now let me just pause for a minute. This is very, very common imagery in the Old Testament. I could show you verses, but for the sake of time, Ezekiel 16 is a great one if you want to do some study on your own. Just read Ezekiel 16. It's all about Israel, and here's essentially what it says there. God says to Israel, remember Ezekiel's the book when they're all being taken off captive into Babylon, and they've really done bad, and it's just a mess. And God says to them, here's what this nation was like. I found you, and you were like a baby, just helpless. No one to take care of you. You were going to die without me. And so I picked you up as a baby, and I raised you, and then you became beautiful, and I married you, and I gave you all this good stuff, and then you became a harlot. And you hooked up with everybody in town. That's essentially in a nutshell Ezekiel 16. And he's saying this was what the nation of Judah, is like. I found you, I established you, everything was great, I blessed you, and then you took all those riches that I gave you and just prostituted yourself out like crazy. Okay? So that's just one example that we find. You can find a lot of this type of imagery in the Old Testament of a woman is a symbol of God's people, or like His church, and a pure woman is God's church when God's church is faithful and pure, and a prostitute is when His church is not faithful and pure, but has blended with the world. Okay, so the ideas, the actions, the attitudes, the worldliness of the world, there's been this compromise, and God calls that prostitution, or fornication is another term, right? Fornication, this means like sexual immorality, is like in the Greek there. But it's essentially the blending of two people in an intimate way that should not be blended together is what that is. So the spiritual imagery of that is the blending of ideas and doctrines and things that should not be blended together. That's like spiritual fornication, okay? Or having, one foot in the world, one foot in the church type of thing. That's kind of that imagery there, okay? All right, so he says, verse 1, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters." What do waters represent? Revelation 17:15. People, multitudes, nations, tongues, etc. Okay? So this prostitute is very influential, very powerful. It's not just one country or one group of people that are influenced here. It's worldwide. Okay? With whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality. And with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers of the earth have become drunk. So this is a This is a deception, a last day deception, a false Christianity that is being believed and followed and taught by the powerful people in the world, okay? And that the regular folk are following too. And it notices it says they have become drunk, okay? How do people behave when they're drunk? Silly, irrational. You ever tried to have a conversation with a drunk person or try to debate anything? It's a waste of time, isn't it? You just can't reason with somebody that's drunk. So that's what this is like. The spiritual fog that's here in the last days, it's like a drunkenness where reason is not affecting people anymore, okay? And by the way, that's a huge issue today. I see this in the world. I'm telling you, it's amazing where, how can I say this rightly? Reason and rationality is being replaced by feelings, okay? And that's not just something with everyday folk. That's something in universities where these ideas are being taught, where it's just these, they're not reasoned ideas, they're not scientific, they're just, people feel a certain way, and that's considered valid. So we're already seeing that now, that there's already this kind of wine of Babylon happening. And I think it's going to keep evolving, and it's going to take more of a spiritual, religious context to it. All right, anyway, let's keep rolling. Verse 3. And he carried me away in the Spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, when was the last time in Revelation that we saw a woman in the wilderness? Anybody remember that? If you don't know the chapter, just kind of tell me what was going on, where you have a woman who's out there in the wilderness. The dragon, right? It's a symbol of the pure church, right? And the dragon's making war with the woman. And then the earth opens up to help the woman, okay? And so we have a pure woman in Revelation 12. But what happens in Revelation 17? There's been that falling away, okay? So it's like the universal church of Christ has morphed in these last days to really become a harlot, okay? And then it says this, verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls. I want you to keep in mind what's being said here. As a matter of fact, I'm going to write it here on the board because we're going to go and now we're about to start unpacking all this here, okay? The woman, remember, a symbol of God's people, was arrayed in purple, scarlet, adorned with gold, jewels, pearls. Oh, she's got a cup in her hand too. That's kind of interesting. Oh, she's got something on her forehead too. All right. She has some insignia on her forehead. Sorry if you can't read that. Okay, this verse 5, and on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon, the great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. Verse 6, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So it's a persecuting power. So a false Christianity that's persecuting the saints, or the true followers of Christ. Okay. So let's unpack this just a little bit. I want you to notice these colors here we have. The purple, the scarlet, the gold, the jewels, the pearls, and so on, and also the name written on the forehead. Now there's some Old Testament imagery to this, okay? So who are we talking about? Let's start out with the name, and let's go to Exodus chapter 28, okay? And we'll look at verses 3 through 8. All right, if somebody maybe can read that for us. Exodus 28. Verses 3 through 8. So as we're reading this, I want you to ask yourself some questions. Who are we talking about here? This is the only other person. By the way, there's only 2 figures that are mentioned in this kind of way, in this kind of context of having like some type of insignia written on their forehead. So when we see this in Revelation, and it's only mentioned one other place, it's clearly drawing a parallel and saying, this is like this, okay? All right, so who's got that for us? Exodus 28, verses 3 through 8. Okay, Yesenia, go ahead. Okay, so it's talking about Aaron, right? And that's the high priest. This is when they're establishing this whole Jewish system of worship, all right, in the days of Moses. So it's talking about the high priest here. Okay, go ahead, Yesenia.
And these are the garments which they taught me: a breastplate and an ephod, and a robe and a broader coat, a mitre and a girdle. And they taught me holy garments for Aaron my brother and his son, that he may minister unto me and receive the offering. And they taught me gold and blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen.
Okay, let's pause for a second. What colors are they taking there? All right, let's see. Gold, purple, scarlet. Wait, well, we don't have blue here, do we? We better keep an eye on it. I think that's insignificant. Blue is missing, right? Okay, but what else we got? We got the jewels, right? They're talking about all this stuff. Fancy things. Okay, keep going, Yesenia.
They taught me that I bought a gold of blue and of purple, of scarlet and fine linen and purple. They taught how the two shoulder pieces thereof join at the two edges thereof, and it shall be joined together. And the purity girdle of the ephod, which is upon it, shall be of the same, according to the work thereof, even of gold, of blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen.
Okay, so I want you to notice there's one color missing here, and that's blue. Okay? And I'm going to give you this text before we leave here, verse 36 and 38. All right, where it says, this is where you have the insignia on the forehead of the high priest. It says, "You shall make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it like the engraving of a signet, holy to the Lord. And you shall fasten it on the turban by a cord of blue." That's significant, okay? "It shall be on front of the turban, and it shall be on Aaron's forehead," okay? So the high priest was to wear this plate, this gold plate that was attached with this blue cord that said "Holiness to the Lord." So here this woman has a name on her forehead that says "Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth." All right? So clearly high priest imagery. This is a woman, a church, all right, saying to the world, I represent God. Okay? And if you want to go to God, you have to go through me. Right? I mean, that's what the high priest was all about. That's what that whole priesthood was back in the day. You couldn't just, I mean, you've always been able to go to God directly, all right, because this is all symbolic with this. In a sense, you've been able to go to God. But we all go through Christ. The high priest was a symbol of Christ. And so there was that most holy place. You know, I won't go through that imagery again, but you know that imagery. We've studied it enough to where, there was this earthly priesthood. Remember, and that was abolished when Jesus died on the cross, right? He's now the high priest and so on. So it is essentially trying to establish like an earthly priesthood that says, you want to go to God, go through me. But there's a color missing, and that color is very, very, very symbolic. See all the same imagery there, okay? Insignia on the forehead, all the fancy jewels. If we were to go through, you could see the different jewels on the breastplate and all that. The gold, the scarlet, the purple. But blue is mentioned over and over, and that is missing. What does blue symbolize in all of this, okay? Let's go to Numbers chapter 15. Okay, and we'll start out in verse 32. There's a story that happens. And let me give you some context before we get in the story. It's going to seem a little harsh what God does here. But let me just say a few things on this. Number one, rebellion's serious. Disobedience is serious because disobedience separates us from God. And a separation from God is fatal. Does that make sense? It's like if you're on life support in the hospital and somebody pulls the plug. What's going to happen? Going to die. So I don't work in a hospital. Vadney, you work in a hospital, I'm sure, right? I'm sure it's kind of a big deal, if somebody's on life support, you don't accidentally unplug it, right? You don't say, I need to plug in the TV. Obviously not, right? It's a big thing if somebody needs this to live, okay? I would imagine you probably get in a lot of trouble if you mess something up and somebody dies at the hospital, right? You can even probably get in trouble with the police doing something like that, all right? So disobedience is an issue because it separates us from God, and the end of that is death. So God has to deal with it strongly, okay? So God's going to deal with the disobedience issue, and He's going to deal with it rather strongly here, and we're going to see what it is, okay? So verse 32. Yesenia, you want to keep being our reader? All right, read verses 32 through 36, okay? That'll give us the story, and then we'll go from there. He's fine. All right, so that's the story, right? So this guy, now keep in mind, they have been going through the wilderness for a long time. This is not early on in their journeys. This is part of that whole 40-year thing where they're going through the wilderness. And God has had to deal pretty roughly with Israel. If He's ever going to be able to get these people into the promised land, they've got to stop all the stuff they've been doing. And so things finally start to kind of get under control a little bit. Does that make sense? All right? And as things kind of start to get under control just a little bit, and the people are starting to obey more, then they got this issue of they've had all this judgment against them and all this bad stuff has happened. They're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. There's been all this rebellion. The rebellion of Korah has happened. Remember that? And the ground swallowed people up. I mean, it's just been a real drama fest, okay? And then finally it's getting together, and then this guy's out here picking up sticks and working on the Sabbath, which is something God had clearly said don't do. And so now they're like, no, man, we can't be having this, okay? Because we've been dealing with a lot of problems, and this is going to just take us back where we were before. We're not going there. And so they take him, and they said, what should we do, okay? And then God says, you got to put him to death. There has to be an example set here to say, you can't do this, okay? And so that's what they do. Now, obviously, the Bible says God doesn't rejoice in the death of anybody, the death of the wicked or anybody, right? So He doesn't want this to happen again. And so He tells them to do something as a reminder to not do this anymore, all right? And it says this in verse 37. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of," what color? Blue on the tassel of each corner, right? So they're to make these tassels, and they're to put blue on those tassels, okay? I saw a Jewish guy actually in Walmart the other day, and he was wearing like a Jewish prayer robe and had the tassels, right? And they still wear these tassels, these little blue things in them, okay? This is where this comes from. All right, a tassel of blue, a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner, and it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord. Not some, but remember all the commandments of the Lord. By the way, does the harlot teach some of the commandments of the Lord? Of course, right? Even most of the commandments of the Lord. Does God want us to keep most of His commandments or all of His commandments? Obviously all, right? It says in the book of James, if we break one, we've broken them all. If we rob a bank, we can't come to the judge and say, but judge, we just robbed a bank. I mean, we didn't speed when we left. We even put money in the meter when we came in, right? So we've kept all the laws except robbing the bank. And so, you think how many laws there are. It's like 10,000 laws. We've kept 9,999. The judge isn't going to say, well, that's pretty good record here, No, if you break a law, you break a law, right? And that's where God's coming from with these things, right? It's His kingdom, and it's a symbol, right? It's a symbol of disobedience there. So He says, this tassel of blue is for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. That harlotry word there, okay? That harlotry imagery. So you shall remember, what does the Sabbath day start with? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to the Lord your God. Be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so the blue is a symbol of God's commandments. Okay. And then where this even comes up is in reference to Sabbath. Okay, so what's the color that is missing here? It's the blue. Okay, so here we have this woman riding the beast, who's claiming to speak for God, and has all the get-up of the high priest, except just missing the color of blue, right? It's just missing the commandments of God, which is pretty important. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you some other things that I just find kind of interesting. It says, speaks of this. Let's go to verse 9. Let me get the imagery right here. Revelation 17. Okay, this calls for a mind with wisdom, the 7 heads or 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. What city on earth is known as a city on 7 hills? Rome is known as a city of 7 hills. Okay. What's interesting is the Vatican is found in Rome. And if you do some reading, this is actually in the Catholic Encyclopedia. It talks about where that district called Vatican, where that comes from, predates it being the Vatican. Predates the church. It used to be just a district of Rome, and it was actually kind of a seedy area of Rome, where there was known to be a lot of brothels and a lot of prostitution and things like that went on back in the ancient Roman days, and it was known as a Vaticanus kind of area or district. And then that became today where the Vatican, is. Now the word Vatican, it's an interesting word. In Latin, it's Vaticanus. Vaticanus. Okay? And that is a construct of 2 words. Okay? Vatic is Annis. Vatic is like prophecy or like an oracle. And Annis is old woman. So put those 2 words together. What do you get? Old woman of prophecy. Okay. Now there is another kind of big picture imagery I want to talk about on this. Can anybody think of a time? I'll give you some hints here. It's in the Old Testament. Remember, you have the kings of Judah, and some are good, some are bad, mostly bad, but a few of them are good. Josiah was a good king. It just left me. Asa was a pretty good king. He had some issues, but he was all right. Anyway, there were other kings that were pretty good. A lot of them that weren't. And remember, you had the northern kingdom. None of them were good. Not a single one of them. Just bad from beginning to end. Right? Not one of them led reforms ever. But like the worst of the worst of the northern kingdom, he had a wife. And man, his wife was something. Right? That's who it was, right? And Jezebel. And what was his name? Remember? Ahab. Ahab and Jezebel, right? And what you see when you read about this, of this story, it's multiple chapters that go on in the Kings of Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel is a Phoenician. She's not a Jew. She's not an Israelite. Ahab's an Israelite. Jezebel is a Phoenician princess. She's a daughter of Baal. The word Baal is in her name, Jezebel, you know. And so she brings this pagan idolatry into Israel. And so there's this blending of truth and error, okay, that's going on in the days of Elijah. And so if you read this story, you see that Ahab is a very kind of weak guy. Jezebel is not weak. She's a woman that knows who she is, knows what she wants, knows what needs to happen. There's even this story of like Ahab wanting to buy a field from a guy. And Ahab's like, hey, sell me this field. And the guy's like, because it's right near Ahab's land. And the guy's like, no, it's belonged to my family and all this. I'm not going to sell it. Hey, I'll give you a lot of money. No, I'm not going to sell it. So Ahab is like pouting and crying in his room. Okay? And then Jezebel's like, what's wrong? Well, this guy won't sell me a field. And she's like, what kind of man are you? Essentially what she says. You know, you're the king. And you're going to whine because this guy won't sell you a field? And you're supposed to be the king? She says, no, we'll take care of this. And so she sets up this scheme. She's a scheming lady, right? You know, she sets up this scheme to where these guys falsely accuse, I forget his name. What's his name? Starts with an N, I want to say. Nabor, is that his name? Anyway, I don't know. They falsely accuse him and say, hey, he committed blasphemy. Like, oh, that's a... Like they really care about that, like Ahab and Jezebel. But that's what the accusation was. Oh, well, he's got to be stoned. So they take him out and stone him. And now he's gone. And now Ahab says, oh, okay, I'll just take his field, right? Jezebel set all that up. She was the one scheming and conniving and making all that happen. So she wears the pants, so to speak. She's the boss of the relationship. She's the strong one. And he kind of does her bidding. So she doesn't really have power on her own. She has power through Ahab, because Ahab's the king. Ahab has an army. Jezebel ain't got an army. But Ahab has an army. Ahab has influence and power, and she's the power behind the throne. She's calling the shots, okay? And she is using the power of the state to enforce false worship. So this is what we're seeing here in Revelation 17. You have a woman riding a beast. Now, if you're riding a horse, who's supposed to be guiding you or the horse? I hope you're in charge if you're riding the horse. If you're on a horse that's running and you're not in charge, that's a bad situation to be in, right? No, the rider is kind of using the horse. We're going left, now we're going right, now we're going fast, now we're stopping, right? Okay, so you have somebody controlling an animal a lot more powerful. So this woman's riding the beast. The beast is the one doing the work and enforcing the decrees, enforcing the laws, enforcing the false worship, but it's the woman calling the shots. That make sense? All right. So this is still future. This isn't going on right now, okay? This is all coming in the future, and then we get to Revelation chapter 18. That is where we really have like the establishment of like Babylon, okay? Satan's final attempt at trying to build like a world government. And then the whole thing is just going to collapse and come crashing down. And they actually turn on this woman. If we were to stay in Revelation 17, do some more reading, it finally gets to the point to where everybody's like mad at her, okay? Because she's promising, just do this. I think Sunday is going to be a big part of this. Hey, we just need to get back to God. If we follow Sunday, then all these disasters will go away, and the disasters get worse. And so it's kind of like when somebody's selling you something, and you're buying into it, and you're already like waist deep into this with them, And they keep telling you, don't worry, it's all going to come together. And you're going, it better. Okay, all right, double down with them. And then finally you get to the point and realize, I have been totally scammed by this person. I've been suspecting this for a while, but I've been kind of ponying up more and more and more to try to get this thing worked out. And now I am mad and ticked off because this person scammed me and led me all the way down this road, okay? That's how essentially the world feels toward Babylon at the end. This has been not worked out, okay? And then Jesus comes, that's Revelation 19, and then that's the end of it right there, okay? Now, let me take some time before we end. We're about to end here. I want to just kind of go over some of the trumpets with you real quick because it kind of ties into some of where we are here. And I'd like to go through and just kind of build it kind of text by text and kind of break it down. But I won't do it. It'll take too much time. So with the trumpets, what we have is like God's judgment on the enemies of His people. Okay? And so you have, really the first trumpet is on the Jewish nation. That, let me give you the second one, is on Rome. Okay? So you have these two co-conspirators who came together to kill Christ. You had kind of like actually Revelation 17 or like Ahab and Jezebel. You got the Jews, like the people of God, that don't have any real power. They can't crucify Jesus, so they have to get the state to do it. All right, so you have the same kind of thing in Revelation 17. False people of God telling the state to persecute. All right, and then we have the church that is kind of going into apostasy. Okay? And then the fourth trumpet is the church in full-blown apostasy. All right, this is going into apostasy. And then we get to the fifth trumpet. Now, the fifth trumpet's pretty interesting. Now, some commentators in the past have talked about Islam and the fifth trumpet. Okay, I think we have some of the modern scholarship out of the Adventist Church, like at Andrews, what they're teaching there, and so on, kind of debunks that. I don't think it's really talking about Islam, but secularism. Okay. Oops. And then the sixth is Babylon, end-time Babylon. All right, and then the seventh trumpet is God's kingdom. So I want to talk. You see, these kind of go together, actually. If you notice, like, what's that? Okay, so you got the Jewish nation in Rome. That's kind of going together there. Then you got the church kind of going into apostasy, and then full-blown apostasy in the period of the Dark Ages. Well, then what happens after that period of the Dark Ages? You have like the French Revolution, and you have this kind of this atheism, this secularism. I would even add liberalism as a part of all these different isms that are on here. That just kind of comes out of this. It's essentially like a humanistic type of philosophy. Okay, that basically says we don't need God. We can. For their own reason, we can construct society a certain way. Communism, all these isms, okay, come out of this. And here's where we're at. I think we're in this right now. We're not in this. We're still in this stage. Here's what's really going to happen, guys. I'll be very honest with you, if I can. I think the biggest danger to religious liberty right now is not from the right. That surprises many Adventists because we think of the enforcement of Sunday laws, and we think that like Pat Robertson and the religious right are going to somehow take over, and it's going to be our friends the Southern Baptists who make everybody go to church on Sunday. That is not going to happen, okay? The religious right is declining in power, does not have the power to enforce this, and will not in the future, okay? The old America is going away. It's going away. It's not going to be like how people think in the past, that's going to happen that way. The left is who is the greatest threat to religious liberty and frankly liberty in general. And let me explain why I think that is. The Scriptures say, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. Okay? So our country, the doctrines of our country, was established because out of a culture of people, British people, who had had a deep experience, I mean, not necessarily those people individually, but the culture itself had had a deep experience with the gospel. Okay? Great Britain had real gospel work in Great Britain, okay, that really went on in the 1600s, 1700s with the Puritans, and then with John Wesley and these kind of, there was a lot of God's Spirit was working in this society of people. The doctrines of we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights such as life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, that would have never come out of Italy, because Italy didn't have the mentality for that, because Italy was a Catholic country. Okay? That would have never come out of Saudi Arabia, not even today. Why? Because they don't have the mentality. It's a Muslim country. It's never going to come out of China. It's not going to come out of anywhere unless a people that have had their culture deeply impacted by the gospel. Does that make sense? Because the gospel and freedom go together. This is why the Pharisees were so against Jesus and so hostile, because they were gospelless. Okay? And so our society, these philosophical, political doctrines that have established, like America, really came out of a gospel way of thinking. Okay? But as our society moves away from that, the Constitution becomes just dead words on paper. There's no words on paper that are going to make anybody do anything. It just comes down to a people that will rightly interpret and apply those things, like the Bible. You can make the Bible say anything you want it to say. You just interpret however you want to. You can do the same with the Constitution. Okay? And so the more secular our society becomes, which is kind of the left that is pushing this secularization, you will notice the less and less freedom there is. This is all throughout societies. If you look in Europe's had a bunch of experiments with this, with communism, with Nazism and fascism and all these different isms out there. As people move away from the gospel and they want to try to construct a society that they think is going to be best, they start using force and coercion to do it. The Nazis did it, the communists did it, and the left today does it in this country, where you are going to bake a cake, and if you don't, we're shutting your business down. Okay, that's how it is. You are going to... There was a guy just fired at Google. Did you hear about that? A guy just got fired at Google for putting out a memo where he just suggested there are differences in men and women. And so maybe that's why that there aren't as many women represented in the tech industry as there are men, because maybe men are more interested in techie kind of stuff than women. They just fired him. No, you cannot even say that kind of stuff. You're fired. We'll destroy your career. So there's all this coercion that kind of goes on there. And so this is where we're at. This is just another example of this, guys. It's just another manifestation of this kind of stuff. It's just the latest flavor of the century or the decade, okay? But what's going to happen is our society is going to keep going down this direction. But every society that's tried this has totally failed. Okay? And our society is going to keep going this direction, and it's going to fail, is what's going to happen. This is not going to work. You can't build a society on these false ideas and whatnot. And this is not just like communism was just I read the Communist Manifesto, okay? And I was amazed. I'll just say this. The same principles that are in that book are the same principles that are being put out, right? Just read the book for yourself. It takes an hour and a half, okay? Same principles being put out today. Nothing new under the sun, okay? That was more than an economic theory. It's a theory of how to structure a society. But in the USSR, they really applied it, and economically the whole thing fell apart, okay? The difference in what's happening now is this is not economic Marxism, this is cultural Marxism. They are deconstructing culture. They're deconstructing family. They're deconstructing so many levels of things, and this is going to end in sociological disaster, okay? And so it's going to be a huge mess. I think we're already there to some degree, but just wait. I mean, we're like knee deep in it. Wait till it's over our head, okay? And then what's going to happen is this fifth trumpet, it's going to be discredited. Just like this. when the church became so corrupt and so apostate, people were like, this is lies. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You know what I mean? Christianity's baloney, man. It's this medieval money fleecing, power, control. No, we're done with that. We're going to embrace this. Well, then this is going to keep riding for enough time, and it's going to get so bad, people are going to say, no, we've got to do something else. And then this is where this comes in. Does that make sense? It's going to be Babylon, okay? And it is going to be, I'm going to get very frank about this. I don't know exactly how it's going to be, but in the book The Great Controversy, we're told it is the union of Catholicism and apostate Protestantism, so Protestants that have not really following the Bible, okay, and spiritualism, okay? We leave that one out a lot of times. We tend to focus a lot on Catholicism in our denomination, but that's not the whole big picture. There's a lot of spiritualism going on in the last days, a lot of manifestation of supernatural things and the working of Satan and so on. And this is going to come together in this last final, almost like world government and culture and philosophy in order to enforce Satan's agenda. And here's how we can avoid being a part of it. Blue tassels. Keeping the commandments of God. That's all you got to worry about. You ain't got to trip on it too. I don't understand the trumpets. That's fine. And maybe I don't even understand it, but that's what I think is the best explanations I've ever seen. But at the bottom line, if we just love Jesus and we're keeping His commandments, keeping His Sabbath, walking in the truth, we're in good shape. And the world will despise you for that. And you got to be able to take it, okay? But God will love you, and He'll bless you, and He'll help you every step of the way. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. That's it. Revelation 17, all right? 18 will be the fall of Babylon. I think I'll just maybe go to 19 next week, and that is maybe the second coming of Jesus. And we're about to be finished up with the class. Any thoughts, any questions before we close with prayer? All right. You want to pray for us, Ron?
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for that blessing that you bestow upon us. We thank you for being able to study your word in freedom and help us to understand and to keep your commandments no matter what. In Jesus' name.
Amen. All right, guys, we'll see you on Sabbath and then next Wednesday. God bless. Good night.